$500,000. For years, that's been the number people quietly measure their retirement against. Hit it, and you're supposedly set. But financial researchers and retirement planners have been increasingly vocal about a hard truth. For a lot of people retiring today or planning to retire in the next decade, $500,000 may not stretch nearly as far as it used to. This isn't about fear-mongering or telling you to panic. It's about understanding why a number that made sense for one generation doesn't automatically transfer to the next one, and what's actually changed underneath it. In this video, we're breaking down exactly why the $500,000 benchmark is losing relevance, what's replaced it in the thinking of financial planners, and how to figure out what your real number might actually look like. Let's start with where this number even came from in the first place. We'll also look, honestly, at what a more realistic number actually depends on, because the answer isn't the same for everyone, no matter how satisfying a single flat number would be to hear. The $500,000 figure didn't come from nowhere. It traces back to a few generations of financial guidance built around a specific set of assumptions. Retiring around 65, living maybe 15 to 20 years past that. Moderate healthcare costs, and a fairly predictable cost of living. Under those assumptions, especially combined with pension income that used to be far more common, $500,000 in savings could genuinely cover a comfortable retirement for a lot of households. The number became a kind of cultural shorthand, a round, achievable-sounding target that got repeated in financial articles, retirement calculators, and casual conversation until it started to feel like an objective fact rather than a rough estimate built on assumptions from a very different economic era. Understanding where a number came from is often the fastest way to understand why it might not still apply. It's a reminder that even common knowledge financial numbers are usually someone's calculation from a specific point in time, not a permanent law of retirement math. The first reason $500,000 is losing ground. Inflation and cost of living have moved in ways that quietly erode fixed savings targets over time. A dollar saved decades ago simply buys less today, and that effect doesn't stop the moment you retire. It keeps compounding throughout retirement itself, sometimes for 2 or 3 decades. Housing costs, groceries, utilities, and everyday expenses have all shifted meaningfully in many markets, and a savings target calculated even 10 or 15 years ago is measuring against a cost of living that's already moved. This is one of the quieter reasons an old retirement number can feel outdated without anyone consciously updating it. The number on paper hasn't changed, but what it actually buys has, and that gap tends to widen the longer someone waits to reassess it. It's easy to miss because nothing dramatic happens on any single day. It just accumulates quietly in the background. Financial researchers sometimes describe this as purchasing power decay. The value doesn't disappear all at once. It just quietly shrinks year after year until the gap between what someone expected and what they can actually afford becomes impossible to ignore. By the time that gap is obvious, it's usually already been building for a decade or more, which is exactly why catching it early matters so much. The second reason, healthcare costs specifically have outpaced general inflation for years, and healthcare tends to become a larger share of spending later in life, not a smaller one. Financial researchers who study retirement spending patterns consistently find that medical and long-term care costs are among the least predictable and most likely to be underestimated in retirement planning, partly because people plan based on current health and current costs, not the costs they may actually face a decade or two into retirement. A savings target built without a realistic buffer for rising healthcare costs is often working with an incomplete picture from the very beginning, even if every other assumption in the plan turns out to be accurate, which makes this one of the harder variables to plan around confidently. This is also why healthcare specifically deserves its own line item in retirement planning, rather than getting folded into general expenses. Treating it as just another category tends to understate how much room it can eventually take up in a monthly budget, especially in the later years of retirement when health needs typically increase rather than level off. The third reason, people are generally living longer than the assumptions baked into older retirement guidance accounted for. A retirement number built around 15 to 20 years of retirement looks very different from one that needs to stretch across 25 or 30 years, and that difference compounds significantly. This isn't a small adjustment. It can mean the same savings amount needs to cover a third more time than it was originally designed for, without necessarily increasing at the same pace. Longer lifespans are generally good news, but they quietly increase the bar for what enough actually means. And it's a factor that's easy to underweight because it feels abstract right up until it becomes the actual number of years someone is living through in real time. It's also worth noting this isn't purely a personal finance statistic. It reflects genuine progress in medicine and quality of life. The financial planning challenge exists precisely because something good is happening, which is part of why it's easy to overlook as a risk factor rather than celebrate as an outcome worth planning properly around. The fourth reason involves how retirement savings are actually meant to be drawn down. For years, a commonly cited guideline suggested withdrawing around 4% of retirement savings annually as a rough rule of thumb for making the money last. But many financial researchers have since revisited that guideline, noting it was built on historical market conditions that don't automatically repeat, and that a more conservative withdrawal rate may be more realistic for some retirees depending on market conditions, time horizon, and individual circumstances. On $500,000, even small differences in assumed withdrawal rate translate into a meaningfully different amount of usable annual income, which means the same savings figure can represent very different levels of actual financial security depending on which assumptions are quietly applied to it behind the scenes. This is one of the more technical reasons on this list, but it matters just as much as the others, because withdrawal rate assumptions quietly determine how much of a nest egg is actually considered safe to spend each year. And a rate that felt conservative decades ago may not carry the same safety margin under different market and economic conditions today. So, what does a more realistic number actually look like today? There isn't a single universal answer, and any video that gives you one flat number without context isn't being fully honest with you. What financial planners increasingly emphasize instead is a personalized calculation based on your expected annual spending, not a fixed savings target borrowed from someone else's situation. A commonly used starting framework involves estimating your expected annual retirement spending and multiplying it by a factor that accounts for a multi-decade retirement, often landing meaningfully higher than $500,000 for households expecting a moderate to comfortable retirement lifestyle, especially in a higher cost of living area. The exact multiplier varies by source and by individual risk tolerance, which is exactly why this is a starting framework for a conversation with a professional, not a number to take at face value from any single video, including this one. This is also why comparing your situation to a friend's or a relative's retirement number rarely tells you much useful information. Two people with identical savings can need very different amounts depending on where they live, what their expected healthcare needs are, and how long their retirement is likely to last, which is exactly why a shared round number was always going to be an approximation at best. Here's a practical way to start estimating your own number. First, calculate your expected annual retirement spending. Not your current spending, your expected spending, since some costs go down in retirement while others, like healthcare, tend to go up. Second, subtract any predictable income you'll have in retirement, like Social Security or a pension, from that annual figure, since that portion doesn't need to come from your personal savings. Third, take the remaining amount your savings actually need to cover and use that figure along with your expected retirement length to estimate a realistic savings target with the help of a retirement calculator or a financial advisor, rather than borrowing a round number from a general conversation. This process takes more effort than remembering $500,000, but it actually reflects your situation instead of someone else's entirely different one. None of these three steps require special financial expertise to attempt on your own. Most banks and retirement platforms now offer basic calculators that can walk you through a version of this process, and even a rough first pass gives you something far more useful to plan around than a number borrowed from a general conversation online. If you run this calculation and the number that comes back feels intimidating, take a breath. This is genuinely common, and panicking doesn't change the math. The most useful next steps are usually the least dramatic ones. Increasing retirement contributions gradually rather than all at once, reviewing whether your current investment mix matches your actual timeline, and looking honestly at what expenses in your future retirement plan are flexible versus fixed. Even small percentage increases in savings rate, sustained over years, compound meaningfully by retirement. The goal isn't to hit a perfect number overnight. It's to move your actual number closer to your real target over time, with a clear picture guiding the adjustments instead of a vague sense that something used to be enough and now might not be anymore. It's also worth remembering that this calculation isn't a one-time event, revisiting it every few years as your income. Expenses and health picture change keeps the target realistic instead of letting it quietly go stale the same way the original $500,000 figure did for an entire generation of savers. So to bring it together, the $500,000 benchmark came from a different era of pensions, shorter retirements, and lower relative costs. Since then, inflation has quietly reduced what a fixed number actually buys. Healthcare costs have outpaced general inflation, people are living longer, and even the standard withdrawal rate guidance has been revisited by researchers. None of this means retirement is impossible or that your specific plan is doomed. It means the old shorthand number deserves a second look, replaced with a calculation based on your actual expected spending rather than a round figure that's been repeated so often it started to feel like fact instead of the rough estimate it always actually was. It's a pattern worth remembering beyond just this one number. Any financial guideline repeated widely enough eventually gets treated as fact, when really it was always a simplified starting point for a much more individual calculation. It's worth saying clearly, needing more than $500,000 doesn't mean you need to be wealthy to retire comfortably. It means the target itself needs to reflect your real expected spending, your real expected income sources, and your real expected retirement length, instead of a number that was accurate for a very different set of circumstances decades ago. The people who adjust their target the earliest tend to have the most room to close any gap comfortably through steady contribution increases rather than dramatic last-minute changes. This isn't a video meant to create anxiety about retirement. It's meant to replace a vague, outdated number with a clearer, more personal one that you can actually plan around with confidence. If anything, understanding why the old number shifted puts you in a stronger position than simply trusting it blindly would have. You now know what's actually driving the target, not just what the target happens to be. Quick note. I'm Zyra, a research presenter, not a licensed financial advisor. Everything in this video reflects general trends and commonly discussed frameworks in retirement planning research, not personalized. Financial advice and retirement planning depends heavily on your individual circumstances, goals, and location. For a calculation specific to your actual situation, a licensed financial advisor is always the better resource than any general video, including this one. Retirement planning involves tax considerations, healthcare specifics, and personal goals that a general video simply cannot account for on an individual basis. If this video made you want to actually run your own numbers, that's exactly the point. Even a rough calculation beats an inherited round number. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. And if you found this useful, a lot of the other habit and mindset breakdowns on this channel